What's a story from history that made you go what the frick? Anne MacDonald, wife of the first Canadian Prime Minister, traveled with her husband out west after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. She was really excited to see the country, but to her dismay she couldn't see much from inside the train because the steam from the engine blocked the view. Her solution: they tied a chair to the cowcatcher on the front of the train and then tied her to the chair. She rode to British Columbia tied to the front of the train like a ship's figurehead. There was a samurai who was actually worried about how obsolete their system had become, and now that samurais were no longer needed in Japan, he decided to go to Korea and insult them so much that they would kill him, and thus the rest samurais would avenge him by going to war with Korea and proving their worth. The Cadaver Synod. In 897, Pope Stephen VI exhumed the corpse of one of his predecessors, Pope Formosus, and put it on trial. He had a deacon stand behind the cadaver and move its mouth and talk for it, while Stephen charged Formosus with becoming pope illegally. When Formosus was declared guilty, the papal vestments were stripped off his rotting body, his blessing fingers were cut off, and he was buried in a graveyard for foreigners. He was then dug up again, and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. His body was retrieved from the river and a later pope nullified the Cadaver Synod, and he is now buried in St. Peter's Basilica in his papal vestments. The cardinals who helped with the Cadaver Synod were excommunicated, and they made a law that cadavers could not be put on trial. Then a later pope upheld Formosus' guilt and put a plaque on Stephen's tomb praising him for his Cadaver Synod. Edit: changed successors to predecessors. Sorry about that. I also revisited this story on Wikipedia and found out that, after being thrown into the Tiber, Formosus' body washed up on shore and started performing miracles. Local people rose up and imprisoned Stephen and later strangled him to death for what he did to Formosus. Just makes an already fabulous story even wackier. How the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the cause of World War I and all the subsequent wars, was a result of bumbling assassins and a stupid stroke of luck. Long story short, after a failed attempt, one of the assassins, Princip, escapes to a restaurant to hide and eat in shame. Ferdinand was on his way to the hospital because his companions were injured in the explosive attempt. Ferdinand driver makes a turn down the wrong street and the car stalls right in front of Princip. Princip then fatally shoots Ferdinand. I'm sure most are familiar with the execution of the Romanov family, the immediate family, with the Tsar and Tsarina and all the kids. However, they didn't stop there. They really tried to get rid of all the Romanovs, including a princess turned literal nun who was thrown down a mine shaft, bombarded with grenades and eventually starved to death. The big thing in Victorian England was wallpaper, which was dyed a certain shade of green. Green was considered to be a calming color, and this particular shade the most beautiful green in the world. It was used not only in wallpaper, but also to dye dresses, fake flowers for hats, and even confectionery. The dye was called Scheele's green, after its inventor. Its key ingredient? Arsenic. Yes, people were happily covering their walls in deadly poison, and quite a few people died as a result. Putting arsenic in wallpaper and other items was never banned by the government, it just fell out of fashion. Rather than use this power to rule, or even conquer new lands, Nero still dreamed of being an artist, cheered by an adoring public. He played the lyre, wrote poetry and sang, but Romans considered the idea of an emperor performing on stage as the ultimate disgrace, demonstrating a disrespectful and scandalous lack of dignity. Nero either didn't care or craved the adulation too much. He forced people to watch his performances without letting them leave, which, Suetonius wrote, led some to pretend they had died, so they would be carried out of the theater. Caligula, Emperor of Rome. Sure, people know about him making his horse a senator, but another story is when he failed to invade Britain after not getting across the channel. Instead of admitting defeat, he chose his most British looking soldiers, marched them back in chains, and paraded them through Rome as his spoils of war. Only thing I can think of are two stories from a book I listened to recently on World War II, specifically from the Siege of Leningrad. One dealt with an elderly woman living in the city who became so maddened by hunger that when she could find no food in her apartment, she went to her cupboards, took every dish and other eating vessel in her home, and broke them on the floor, before scrounging through the debris in search of crumbs. The other involved young people, can't remember how old they were, who went out into the city in search of horse meat and witnessed a truck carrying a pile of bodies and body parts from the countless dead littering the streets, both from starvation and the German shelling. They heard a voice come from someone near the bottom of the pile. "I'm not dead. Please help me." Then the truck drove off. Krassus, a Roman politician, is said to be one of the richest people in history. He had a number of endeavors, but one was real estate. He didn't buy property in the conventional sense. He formed a fire department to serve the city. When a fire broke out, he rushed there and asked if he could buy the property for its value. The owner usually would agree, because while they would lose their home, the fire department would put out the fire and they would keep their possessions. If they didn't agree, he just stood there and watched it burn. Once everything was destroyed, he would offer again, at a pittance of the original price. At one point he owned 1/3 of the real estate in the city of Rome, in about 70th BC, when Rome was immensely wealthy. It's got to be the 10th BC to stand in the Battle of Yao Tang Bridge. Basically 900 plus Filipino soldiers, cooks, medics and a chaplain were left abandoned against around 3,000 to 5,000 Chinese troops, with propaganda proclaiming it to be 40,000. They weren't even forced out of the position at the end of the battle and actually lead a successful counterattack to retrieve some of their forces before they were ordered to retreat. So yeah, what the fuck? Imagine being the chaplain. One moment you're giving the battalion a morning ceremony. A few minutes later you're doming a Chinese conscript with your 1911. HMS Dreadnought was designed to be the most modern battleship of the time. They still decided to put a ram on it, as other ships in history would often ram each other, despite her guns being able to hit opponents at a much longer range than a ram would be useful at. She only sank one enemy vessel in World War I. A U-boat, which she rammed. It's the only time a battleship successfully destroyed an enemy submarine intentionally. Another little one, Admiral Hood, was killed in a magazine explosion. Later, the HMS Hood was destroyed in a magazine explosion. Gonna go with the US almost going into a full-on near with the UK over a pig. The Pig War was, effectively, a territorial dispute on a small island at the then edge of the American Empire in the 1850s. What ultimately sparked off hostilities was a UK man shooting a pig of an American settler on the island and the two forts nearby, one UK and one American, pretty much losing their crap over each other for no reason. In the end cooler heads prevailed thankfully, but yeah, we almost had another war in the 1850s. 1859 if I remember correctly, over a pig and the money the pig would have brought the farmer, but in the end a pig. Primary problem with the pig was that the lines of the edge of the American and UK border were kind of poorly written at the time. She basically had stated that the line was down a river and this island was in the middle of said river. The issue of course being then it didn't state which side of the island that the line followed, which side of the island was still the river. In the end I believe the Germans were called in for arbitration and they eventually agreed that the Americans were in the right. No one ever knows what happened to the pig. In fact, it actually took so long to fix that the British and Americans both occupied forts on the island for some time, and in fact the Northern British camp is still symbolically has the English flag raised and lowered on it by American personnel. I'm not actually sure if they are soldiers or not, making it the only place on American soil that is not an embassy where the English flag is still raised and lowered on a daily basis. But yeah, that is how a pig can start a war. Vincent van Gogh, one of the greatest painters of all time, died by shooting himself in the stomach twice at a bar. He didn't immediately die though. Apparently he walked home, laid in his bed alone for 2 days, until he eventually passed away. It took the investigators back then a very long time, not sure exactly how long, to determine if it was a murder or suicide. Maybe it's not too shocking, but I just think it's a very odd way to die. British intelligence, during World War II, stuffed dead rats with explosives and had agents drop them anywhere in Nazi-controlled buildings. This was under the belief that German soldiers or the janitorial staff would pick them up with a shovel and throw the carcasses into the building's furnace. This would then cause the furnace to blow up, and every time they saw a dead rat from that moment on, the Nazis would bring in a bomb squad. I heard that they actually did this once or twice, and it worked lol. This one is more personal. I have an ancestor, not sure exact relation, whose neighbor was beating my ancestor's kid. Ancestor proceeds to beat the heck out of the neighbor. In court, she was ordered to pay a $10 fine, which was a lot of money back then. Next time the neighbor beat on her kid, she marched down to the courthouse and slapped $10 on a counter. When asked what it was for, she said, "I'm going to go get my money's worth." Brigate Ross, far-left terrorist group active in Italy in the 1970s to 80s, planned to kidnap centrist politician Aldo Moro. To kill his bodyguards, they hid guns in bags and dressed up as flight attendants waiting for their bus to the airport to avoid being sus while waiting for Moro's car to come to a junction. Their plan almost failed when a old lady stopped by asking them infos about some incoming flights. She left just minutes before the attack. Aldo Moro ended up getting kidnapped and killed. The Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. After a failed coup d'etat that the military successfully pinned on the Communist Party of Indonesia, there were months of unrest in which military, police, and civilians murdered over 500,000 Communist Party members, suspected communists, ethnic Chinese people, members of the feminist organization Jerwani, and Javanese Abangan Muslims. The CIA took an active role in the killing, providing lists of suspected communists for the military to kill, and later supporting the dictator Suharto in his rise to power. The killings are still not discussed in Indonesian history textbooks because of Suharto's intensive suppression of information. In 1918 in Quebec City, the Canadian Army shot at the crowd and killed 4 civilians. It started when 2 Dominion police constables, sent to Quebec to track down people trying to evade conscription, stopped a young man, Joseph Mercier, in a bowling alley to ask for his exemption certificate. When Mercier said he didn't have the paper with him, the constables arrested him. An angry crowd of 2,000 gathered and refused to be appeased, even when Mercier was later released. Rioters broke into a police station and beat up several officers. In the following days, violence spread as crowds hurling rocks and blocks of ice filled the streets. The Borden government, which had been expecting civil violence, proclaimed martial law and dispatched 6,000 troops from Ontario and Western Canada to Quebec, a massive presence given the pressing need for soldiers on the European front. French-speaking troops were kept in their barracks because the government did not trust them to remain loyal. On April 1st, troops fired on the crowd, killing at least 4, with more than 150 injured, including soldiers. The 4 victims, ranging from age 14 to 49, were all local residents with no known political affiliations. A coroner's inquest concluded the main cause of the riot was the tactless way Dominion police enforced the Military Service Act. It was many years ago I saw this story in a history book, so it might be missing a few details, but basically there was a herb healer treating some patients in the Middle Ages. There was a woman with consumption and a soldier with a wound on his leg. He gave medicine to the woman that would help her and disinfected the soldier's wound and wrapped it up. An English doctor then walks in and declares that the herb healer has no idea what he is doing and cannot treat the patients. He takes a look at the woman and concludes something along the lines of her being possessed by the devil. He grabs knife and cuts across onto her forehead, and I think he took her brain out and rubbed salt onto, or just put salt onto it through the cut. Anyway, he says she's cured, but well, she's dead now. He then moves over to the soldier and decides for some reason that his leg is no good anymore and tells someone to bring the sharpest axe they can find. A little later the person returns with an axe and the doctor proceeds to lay the soldier's leg flat and then lifts up the axe and brings it down on the leg. Bone marrow flies all over the place and the soldier dies of shock. The doctor decides has done a good job and cured his patients and takes his leave. In 1598 during a storm a Polish-Lithuanian ship crashed at the coast of Sweden. When the sailors, there were 12 of them, realized that Stockholm is near, they decided to take it, and they freaking did it. They entered the city at night and called the local elites. The leader of sailors, Samulaski, announced that Stockholm was in Polish hands and ordered the elites to submit. Everyone agreed and, as Aski ordered them later, sent their men to secure all strategic points. Later Aski managed to save 500 remnants of the Polish fleet, which resulted in having a small army. Aski moved away after the war ended. The whole Mughal ruling period. In India, They burned libraries, smashed and destroyed temples, ruthlessly murdered civilians, mistreated women and children. Like and subscribe for more Reddit videos.